My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
I am reminded of the privilege and honor I have in working to advance justice, inclusion, and equity in higher education. Part of that privilege is getting to support and advocate for some of the most amazing students. It is my great honor to introduce one of those students today, our leader of ceremonies, Jaden Hines. Jaden is a senior at the University of North Dakota, majoring in commercial aviation and aviation management. Jaden is a member of the Organization of Black Aerospace Professionals, the Black Student Association, the Latin Student Organization, a student diversity and inclusion peer educator, and a member of the Black History Month 2022 Planning Committee. Please join me in welcoming Jaden Hines.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Stacy. As Stacy said, my name is Jaden Hines, and this is my 4th year here at the University of North Dakota. And it is my absolute honor to serve as your leader of ceremonies for our Martin Luther King Jr. Day events. To say some words on Dr. King and what he represents to me, I would like to share some of my thoughts. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is a man who wasn't afraid to fight for social change, even when the rest of the world violently opposed his ideals and dreams. His leadership set an example to all people on how to approach a fight when it comes to social inequity. Through the use of nonviolent means, Dr. King sought to use power of words with the expressions of dignity, respect, education, determination, and faith. As a way to fight for change, Dr. Martin Luther King has dedicated himself to the service of his community, and today we are here to celebrate some of those who have continued Dr. King's legacy by not only recognizing the need for social change, but also have dedicated themselves to the service of their own communities. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is considered to be a holiday federally recognized as a day of service. With today's speakers and events, we hope this to be an encouragement for you to look and continue Dr. King's legacy by finding your own ways to provide service for your community. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce someone who has actively been serving their community through his role here at the university. Please welcome to the stage the University of North Dakota's president, Andrew Armacost.
Well, can you hear me? Good. Thank you. It's great to be here on this day of celebration and to honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I have to share a personal perspective. And that personal perspective is, I was alive when Dr. King was assassinated, but I was only 5 months old. And yet, the legacy of Dr. King certainly had a profound impact on my life. If I think about my childhood in Bowie, Maryland, in Prince George's County, if you think about the early 1960s, when my town was constructed by the Levitt Corporation, it was what was known as a Levitt town, which was a mass-produced community, and the Levitt Corporation would only sell to white families. By the time I moved in 1971, that had changed. And the schools and the community had become much more integrated. And in fact, the examples that I saw at Meadowbrook Elementary School were ones of harmony in spite of what was happening in the world around. Our playmates came from multiple races. My kindergarten teacher, a Black woman by the name of Mrs. Jones, I don't know her first name, nobody ever does with their kindergarten teachers, and our principal, Lucy W. Marr, who we knew as our leader. She wasn't our Black woman leader. She was our leader. And the interesting part of this is, as young children, the benefit to me as a young white child growing up in Bowie was the fact that I was seeing examples of leadership across all races. Seeing an example, we often talk about how these examples are important for young Black children growing up in the schools. For me, it was important as a young white child growing up in schools to see that example of pure leadership. Then I moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin at age 10. And in that community, we had the same focus on how do we bring our schools together. And there were a number of leaders in the city of Milwaukee. Reuben Harpole, who was known as the mayor of Milwaukee, the real mayor of Milwaukee, and Howard Fuller, who would later become the superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools, were examples, bright examples of leadership in our community to try to achieve that harmony, particularly in our school systems. It is that set of experiences for me that has impacted my life, and it's a direct result of the work of Dr. King and many others in the civil rights community. So each time this year, I think and reflect upon my life experience, but I also think of Dr. King's words. And in the famous I Have a Dream speech, there's a phrase that has always caught me, and let me share it with you. It says, when the architects of our great republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American would fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Dr. King in that speech also went on to say that although the government had written a bad check to his people, that, quote, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. I'm here today to tell you that UND pledges its commitment to make sure that bank issues on this promissory note, the promise for opportunity for all, and the promise for a campus that is free from discrimination and supports each and every one of its members. I'm delighted to be here today. Let's celebrate Dr. King's rich legacy by living out the great example of love and peace with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, President Armacost, for your welcoming remarks. At this time, I would now like to welcome Dr. Tom Bailey, Special Assistant to the President for Diversity and Inclusion, to the stage to introduce today's keynote speaker. Please help me welcome Dr. Bailey.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. Well, my eyes are getting bad, so I have to wear glasses. So, well, again, good morning. It is a rare experience to have the opportunity to introduce one of your parents to an attentive audience. It is even a rarer experience to have the opportunity to introduce one of your sheroes. This morning, I have the opportunity of doing both. Rosalind Woodward Pellis is a veteran of the civil and workers' rights movement. She has a long history of social justice activism that has spanned more than 60 decades, beginning with her work as a teenager with the Congress of Racial Equality. Mrs. Pellis is currently the Vice President of Repairs of the Breach, a nonpartisan organization that seeks to build a progressive agenda and movement rooted in the moral values of justice, fairness, and the common good. She also serves as the Senior Strategic Advisor to the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. And this is a continuation of Dr. King's work. She is the former Executive Director of the North Carolina NAACP. While serving in that role, She also served as a senior strategist and advisor to North Carolina's Moral Monday Forward Together movement. During the pivotal and historic year when Moral Mondays erupted in the state capital of Raleigh, spreading across the state and inspiring a nation. If you haven't looked up the work of the efforts of the Moral Monday, challenging the gerrymandering that took place in North Carolina, please do. And as you start thinking about the conversations that people are having in this country about what exactly is gerrymandering, we have to be aware of that. And so it was imperative that the NAACP in North Carolina stood in opposition to what was happening in an attempt to remove the right to vote for so many of the citizens of that state. And so Mrs. Pellis was directly involved in that. Prior to this work, she also served as the director of the Civil, Human, and Women's Rights Department at the National American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL-CIO. She also served as the executive director of the Union Community Fund, a national labor charity created to provide funding for social and economic justice organizations. Also, she served as the executive director of the National Rainbow Coalition and special assistant to Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr. Mrs. Pellis also served on the board of directors for the Highlander Research and Education Center. She was the board chair and on the National Board of Interfaith Worker Justice. Rosalind Pellis was named one of the country's outstanding African-American women labor leaders by the Institute of Policy Studies in the And Still I Rise Black Women Labor Leaders Initiative. She was also the 2019 recipient of the Forward Justice Ella Baker Award. She has been a lecturer. She has led workshops across the United States and in Canada, Tanzania, and in Uganda. She has received a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology from North Carolina Central University and a Juris Doctorate degree from Howard University School of Law. I'm blessed to say that she is married and has 3 sons, one of which is standing up here today, if you didn't gather that. But I ask that you all please join me in warmly welcoming my mother, my shero, Rosalind Woodward Pellis.
Can I take this off from here? I won't. So first of all, it is unique to have your son introduce you in this kind of setting. And I'm telling you, it's some better introduction than I've ever had. So I thank you for that. So good morning to all, and thank you, Dr. Bailey. I'm honored to join everyone here at the University of North Dakota into a celebration of the Martin Luther King Day holiday. I offer special thanks to President Armacost, to Dr. Stacy, I have to make this sure I get this right, Borboa Peterson, and to Tom McQueen, and then all the people who made this day possible. You know, this holiday has been celebrated nearly 40 years. The first Dr. Martin Luther King Day was officially observed in January 20, 1986. Dr. King became the first private citizen in the United States to be honored with a federal holiday. This celebration and recognition of Dr. King is of critical importance to our nation. It is also of special importance to me. For our nation, having this federal holiday not only honors a great national leader and champion of civil rights, but stands as a reminder of the long struggle in this country for civil and human rights. It challenges us to be vigilant in protecting these rights, and it is a call to all of us to hold America true to her promise of equality and fair treatment for all who live here. For me, this day set aside to honor Dr. King is of particular and personal importance. Dr. King has been a major and continuous influence in my life beginning when I was 13 years old and in the Congress of Racial Equality in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My church, St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, was the headquarters for the civil rights movement in my hometown. This is where I was trained in Kingian nonviolence and then practiced it on picket lines and in sit-ins at segregated restaurants, movie houses, and every other place in my town. Even as a girl, Dr. King's message resonated with me. I learned to stand up against injustice, even when people responded to peaceful protests with violence. I learned that nonviolence is transformative, and most of all learned that justice eventually will win. I was also among the 250,000 people who traveled to Washington, D.C. on that hot day in August 1963 for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. There I heard Dr. King's words that inspired the nation. In 1964, I met Dr. King when he came to my hometown to speak and offer support for a voter registration project that we were engaged in. I was proud at that moment to tell him and all that would listen that during that campaign to register Black voters, I was part of a team that registered my own grandfather. I registered him to vote for the first time at the age of 69. 69 years old was the first time he had registered to vote in North Carolina. And while he could hardly write his name, he recognized the importance of having the right to vote. I've since worked with and learned from many of those who have been in Dr. King's inner circle in the early days. Ann Braden, Jack Odell, Reverend Billy Cowles, James Orange, and Reverend Jesse Jackson. And my work today is with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, which is a continuation of Dr. King's work. Dr. King was in fact engaged in this work at the time of his death. To this day, I continue to be guided by the work toward Dr. King's vision of a country where all people are guaranteed human and civil rights, are treated with dignity and respect, and have equal access to economic opportunity. It is because of Dr. King's teachings, his work, and his example that I have been in the struggle for social justice for 60 years. This holiday is of special importance to me. Now, this morning, we gather as a community to celebrate and honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I believe we should first take a few minutes to remember who Dr. King actually was. As the years have passed, there have been efforts to rewrite history and to sanitize his image. We have been bombarded with images in fast food commercials, on the internet, and even in department store ads for Dr. King Day sales. We've often found that these images and messages have been distorted and minimize his historic significance. He is mostly remembered for his "I Have a Dream" speech. It is in this image of him speaking at the March on Washington where we most often find him locked in history. We find him locked in time there. And we know that even in that recollection, there's a distortion. That is because the words that are most often repeated from that speech are not what Dr. King himself considered to be the main message he wanted to send to America that day. We often hear about his dream that all of us would sit down together at a table of brotherhood, his dream that his 4 little children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, and his dream that we would be able to transform the discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. These were great and inspiring words. They were words we aspire to. However, these words were only added that day. They were only added that day to his prepared text. And it happened when gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, in the middle of his speech, called out to him and said, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." She had heard this in an earlier speech. At that time, he put aside his prepared remarks and added the dream section. His speech, his original speech, was called Normalcy Never Again. It was called that because his speech was meant to be a call to action that day. It was a call to action in the wake of attacks on democracy and the unfulfilled promises of equality and basic human rights to Black Americans. In that speech, King described the promises made by America as a promissory note on which America had defaulted. King said that day, America has given the Negro people a bad check, but we've come to cash that check, he said, by marching in Washington. Marchers were told that the time to act was upon them. He said, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. He instructed marchers to return home and to continue acting, continue making a difference. Dr. King told all those present and the nation that day, we have also come to this hollowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. There is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or taking the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. These were not the words of one who only dreams. This is but one example of the distortion of King's words and deeds. There are many others. For some people, it's easier to remember and to celebrate and honor Dr. King, the dreamer. Dr. King cannot be remembered as a dreamer or a great orator. He cannot be frozen in time. So who was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? He was a visionary, a preacher, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a philosopher, a revolutionary, a good troublemaker, a champion of nonviolent direct action, and a truth teller. Yeah, he was all those things that we sometimes don't hear about. Reverend King joined hands with Rosa Parks to lead the Montgomery Bus Boycott. In 1955, when King was chosen to be the spokesperson for the bus boycott, he was an unknown, hardly known any place in the country. Out of that experience, he later founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and took on issues of discrimination in transportation and voting rights. In cities all over the South and the country, Dr. King stood against unjust laws in the Jim Crow era. He led the marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He stood with and supported the work of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He brought a moral underpinning to movements for civil and human rights. Dr. King spoke out against unjust wars, especially the war in Vietnam. He was a 1964 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for his leadership of the civil rights movement and commitment to achieving racial justice. At that time, at 35, he was the youngest to receive that prestigious award and the only second African American. He later defended workers' rights, his last act before his assassination. That was in support of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. King reminded us then that all labor that uplifts humanity has dignity. He also spoke to the nation about the nature of our economic system that worked for a few and left many behind. He was a champion and advocate for the poor. He brought together people of all races to struggle against systemic racism, poverty, and militarism. Dr. King was more than a dreamer. We cannot freeze his memory in that speech in '63. Reclaiming Dr. King, the man, his words, and his work is critical. This is the Dr. King we have to remember today. Now today, not only are we called here to celebrate Dr. King, we are also asked to ponder the question, where do we go from here? The question in and of itself presumes that we are at a crossroads and that we have to decide where we want our country to go. where we want our community to go. It comes as no surprise that Dr. King himself also grappled with the same question. In his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, and in a speech at the 11th Annual Southern Christian Leadership Conference Convention in Atlanta, where he and other civil rights leaders from across the nation came together to look at the progress made. Both these things happened in '67. And in those places, he raised this question. In the SCLC meeting, where they had the arduous task of trying to figure out their road ahead, Dr. King advised, now, in order to answer the question, where do we go from here? We must first honestly recognize where we are now. Dr. King spoke often about the critical importance of knowing the truth and telling the truth in pursuit of justice. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? He writes, it is time for all of us to tell each other the truth. He who lives with untruth lives in spiritual slavery. Freedom is still the bonus we receive for knowing the truth. He continued, you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. With this as a touchstone, in that SCLC conference, Dr. King discussed the state of the movement after a decade of work in civil rights. He outlined the victories and the challenges of the justice movement then. He also looked at the work of the SCLC, where they dissected that work, both looking at victories and challenges. But he also went further on that day. He also acknowledged that for Black folks in America at that time, that was not enough. He recited the problems that still existed for Black people. Half of all Black people at that time lived in substandard housing. The rate of infant mortality among Black folks was double that of whites. Of employed Black people, 75% held menial jobs. For the majority of Black people then, they lived in poverty, and poverty was rampant. For Black children, less money was spent on their education, creating a gap in learning for those children. His list went on and on. He also observed that at that time, there were racial tensions and uprisings across the country. It was this understanding that made it possible for SCLC to undertake the task of figuring out the road forward for the organization and their work inside the movement. Today, as we celebrate Dr. King's birthday, this country again is at a crossroads. We are again forced to ask the same question. Where do we go from here? And Dr. King's 1967 admonition must be our guide today. In order to ask that question, where do we go from here? We must first honestly recognize where we are right now. The times in which we live today are in many ways similar to 1967. Today, yes, we've seen progress, and there has been reaction and backlash to that progress. We've also seen retrenchment. Today, we see political and social polarization at an unprecedented level. Communities of people in the richest country in the world are unable to afford the basic necessities of life. Millions of folks who do not make a living wage. Millions of folks do not make a living wage, while the majority of wealth is held in the hands of a few families in this country. Here, there are 140 million poor and low-income people of all races. Systemic racism in the workplace, in schools, in housing, almost everywhere is at a staggering high. There is a national reckoning over white supremacy and racist violence. The number and names of those who suffer unnecessary deaths at the hand of racists is hard to keep up with because there are so many. We are in the middle of a pandemic where over 800,000 people have died. The casualties are mostly people of color and poor folks. Those who suffered because of poor health and poor health care before the pandemic, or those who were made sick because they were essential workers who became expendable because they were not protected. And now our most fundamental rights are under attack. The right to vote. The right to vote has been threatened in at least 19 states through new voter suppression laws. At this very moment in Washington, D.C., our elected officials are dragging their feet on the passage of legislation aimed at fighting voter suppression and restoring their enforcement provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In fact, today in Washington, the son of Martin Luther King Jr. is remembering his father by leading a national voting rights march. He says this is the best way to celebrate his father. So what you've heard is a snapshot of the chaos in this country, what we see today. So where do we go from here? It is my hope on this day, our answer to this question can be found and is rooted in our deepest moral and constitutional values. My hope is that we as a community and a nation are guided by our faith and our moral conscience and our intention to continue to build a more perfect union as described in the preamble of the United States Constitution. That intention to establish justice, that intention ensures domestic tranquility, provides for the common defense, promotes the general welfare, and secures blessings of liberty. My hope is that we together can work toward building the beloved community that Dr. King described years ago. Dr. King's beloved community is a vision. It's a vision in which all people can share the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and of brotherhood. In the beloved community, disputes will be resolved. They will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of by military force and power. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice will prevail over war. All of that is the beloved community. Dr. King saw this as not a lofty goal, but he saw it as achievable. And I believe it too. I believe we can do it. Dr. King would say achieving this would require a revolution of values. He would say our society must be transformed into a person-centered society where racism, sexism, classism, ageism, homophobia, and all other forms of oppression experienced by marginalized communities have no place. Dr. King would again say, as he said all those many years ago, our goal is to create a beloved community, and this would require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our lives. We can get there, but we have to act. We have to work for that beloved community, wherever we are and however we can. Our contribution can be big or it can be small, but we have to be part of the transformation. We can be actively engaged in movement building for change. We can work in organizations. We can do other direct work, or we can simply make sure that we in our daily lives act in ways that move us toward this goal. Dr. King reminded us change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And it will take all of us. It will take all of us who gather here to celebrate Dr. King's life and legacy and work. It will take people all over this country to make this transition. We must make it. We have no choice. This may not be easy. This may make us fearful. This may make us afraid. This may make us worry about what others might say or what others might do, but we must act. King had a lot to say on this. He said the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of convenience and comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and times of controversy. We must find a way, each of us, to work toward building the beloved community. We must be dissatisfied with chaos. We must be dissatisfied with the status quo. His final message at that LCLC meeting in 1967, when they pondered this question, Dr. King concluded by saying that there was a task at hand, and he urged people to leave that place with what he called divine dissatisfaction. Divine dissatisfaction. He said, let us be dissatisfied until those who live on the outskirts of hope are brought into the metropolis of daily security. Let us be dissatisfied until slums are cast into the junk heaps of history and every family will live in a decent sanitary home. Let us be dissatisfied until men and women, however Black they may be, will be judged on the basis of the content of their character and not on the basis of the color of their skin. Let us be dissatisfied. Let us be dissatisfied until every state capital will be housed by a governor who will do justly, who will love mercy, and who will walk humbly with his God. Let us be dissatisfied until from every city hall, justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Let us be dissatisfied, and men will recognize that out of one blood, God made all men to dwell upon the face of this earth. And so the best way, the very best way that we can honor Dr. King today and as we move forward is to choose community over chaos, to find the courage, the will, and the divine dissatisfaction to act in service of building the beloved community. Thank you.